Well, thank you again for that great plenary talk. At this point, I would like to introduce the first session this morning, Data Management and Distribution. And I'd like to introduce the leader of this session, someone who really needs no introduction here at Brown, Professor Jan Hesthaven. Jan joined Brown in 1995. He's currently a professor of applied mathematics. He's director of the Center for Computation and Visualization, CCV, and he's deputy director for ICERM, the Institute for Computational and Experimental Research in Mathematics. And he's an expert in the analysis and development of new techniques for analyzing very complex physical systems. So, Jan.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. As was just mentioned, I'm not a material scientist. I'm a mathematician, but I care a lot about how complex data can be used to drive discovery and innovation. And I think this is what this first session is about, is how we can use some of the tools that is developed to analyze large data to drive some of the ideas that was just mentioned. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the introduction here. I've taken the liberty of renaming the session. Because I think this captures perhaps better, since I know what's coming. Thought I would do that, but
data-driven materials by design.
Oh, are you going to change my title now? So anyone who's been in sort of in the country for the last decade is well aware that the idea of using data and using predictive computing is one that has given birth to a number of very influential reports and papers over the last decade, highlighting the issue that in order to drive discovery and innovation and also to ensure competitiveness, we need to think about how to use computing and data in a much more, in a much stronger way perhaps that has been done in the past. And in fact, there are sort of a number of interesting outcomes of that. Some have claimed that this way of looking at science is the end of science. Most people disagree, but nevertheless, it's an interesting notion. But perhaps more interestingly, down in the corner is the fact that if those of you who followed the World Economic Forum in January will recognize, and in fact, there were a number of sessions at the World Economic Forum focused on how big data is influencing increasingly businesses and policy making. And also to touch on the issue that was just mentioned about getting the various communities involved, the math communities have gone together and declared April the Math Awareness Month. And in fact, the Math Awareness Month is focused on math statistics and the data deluge. So this is not, so maybe this is a community that should be more heavily involved. But also I like the visual, what would you do with all this data? And so for those of you who are still not fully convinced about the idea of using design by data, I wanted to show you this one, which is the optimal umbrella. So this is actually designed to provide optimal coverage in windy conditions, right? So if you live in Providence, you'll appreciate that. So with that, let me introduce the two speakers that we have today. So the first one is Laura Haas. She's the director of the Institute, a newly created Institute for Massive Data Analytics and Modeling at IBM. Laura is an IBM fellow. There's only 64 of those currently active out of 200,000 technical people at IBM, so that's a rare breed. She's a graduate of UT Austin and has been at Brown for the last 25 years, focusing on data and analytics in a variety of different areas. And she'll talk to us about not only the material side, but also how perhaps we or you can learn from how data is used in other disciplines already. And the second speaker, let me do it right away, it's Krishna Rajan, who is probably known to most of you, has been an innovator in data-driven modeling and design in materials for a number of years, is the director of the Institute for Combinatorial Discovery, which to me sounds like a mathematician, but Clearly, I'm wrong. He's the Wilkinson Professor of Interdisciplinary Engineering and has published extensively as well as hold a number of visiting positions and has been involved also on the policy side. So I think the combination of the two would be an interesting start of this meeting. So with that, I would like to invite Laura to give her presentation. After that, we'll see how time evolves, and I'll run a tight ship in terms of time. So please.
So I am not a material scientist. Some of my best friends are material scientists, but I'm not. I have, however, always been very interested in data. My whole career at IBM has been about integrating different kinds of data, very heterogeneous sources of data, and trying to get insight out of them. And lately we've been talking about not insight, but foresight, predictive ability out of the data itself. And it sounds great and it sounds grand, but it's not so easy to achieve. So what I'm going to try and do briefly today is tell you a little bit about some of the challenges that come to get to the point where you can start to get foresight out, maybe a part of the process that you've all slogged through but haven't really thought so much about. And then I will give you an example of the kinds of tools that are now available that can be exploited for this, and an application of those tools that we've done in a sort of a neighboring space to yours with the pharmaceutical industry. So hopefully that will start some thoughts. Okay. The first problem is that getting out from the data, the raw data, to the foresight is a very long process, and I won't belabor the point here. Simple example, here's a doctor, most natural question in the world. I've got a patient with a tumor. How do I find other patients similar to my patient, how those patients have been treated, and then you know, from that deduce what would be the best treatment program for my patient? That is a very, very hard problem. In fact, I first used a version of this chart in 1993, and I'm embarrassed to still be using it. But we haven't solved this problem yet. What's the problem? Well, the problem is what is similar to my patient. Similar to my patient is more than just you know, two numbers that you compare. It depends on the size and shape of the tumor. You're going to get that from radiology sorts of things. It depends on their genomic information. We know increasingly that the person's genome actually tells us a lot more about what treatments are going to be effective than not. That's a whole nother set of data, another set of types of analysis. It depends on a bunch of lab tests and lab results, all different kinds of data. Worse, all this data comes from very different systems, sometimes from different labs, not all of whom will use the same reference for this patient. So how do you even know that I've got the right data for this patient together? I can go on for a while, but I think you get the idea. There are a bunch of very fundamental problems. It's not just medicine, of course. I'll get these buttons right by the end. You can take lots and lots of other sorts of examples. This one was my son's first summer internship. He was asked to put up for an environmental engineering firm a little application that let somebody calculate their carbon footprint, and he was given spreadsheets from a lot of manufacturers and consumer reports like data and government reports, and he had to somehow figure out when a person gave him the name of, you know, typed in their appliances, how much energy those were consuming. Not easy. Very, very dirty data, missing data. Some of these reports would have information about these appliances, others don't. Some use one metric, the others use another. How do you convert? A lot of it in spreadsheets which don't get queried nicely, very difficult. He called me, "Mom, you're an information integration specialist." Okay, that was not the highlight of my mothering experience. Okay, so here are some of the things that you have to do with data. You have to get it, first of all. That's always a challenge. Then you've got to kind of somehow bring it together, clean it up, add more information around it till you have a good idea of the various, what we call entities that are in there, match them up, figure out where you've got missing data, incomplete data, clean that up. You've got to figure out how you're going to store them, what kinds of queries are you going to do, et cetera. Then you can start thinking about building some kind of complex model around them, or running some of your wonderful mathematical analytics on them. Then we get to the problem of mathematicians are really good at thinking up algorithms, and they kind of know how they want to analyze this. But when you start throwing terabytes or even petabytes of data at something, you need a whole different set of algorithmic skills. And that's where computer scientists tend to come in, but we're not always that connected. And so this whole set of skills about how to run things efficiently with the large data volumes becomes a problem. And then you've got to be able to visualize the data, or in other ways share and collaborate with folks. So, you know, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of different expertise. That expertise is expensive. And that, you know, is one of the grand challenges, if you will, around doing this sort of data-intensive work. A part of the problem, a big part of the problem, comes out of the data itself. And the industry, the data part of the world, and IBM in particular, we like to talk about the 4 V's of data. It's catchy, it's memorable. We talk about the volume. That's the thing most people think about when they think big data, right? When they talk about data deluge, they're thinking about the bigness, the volume. But actually, in some ways, the volume are things we can deal with. It's hard, it's challenging, but this data is data at rest. It tends to be big, deep pools of data that you have various ways to take and to analyze. Another thing that's changing in today's world is the velocity of data. It's become possible to get very, very precise readings happening very, very rapidly off of a range of instruments. And that means data flying at you, maybe not quite in the terabyte or exabytes of data volume unless you're dealing with imaging, but still a lot of data coming at you that you have to respond to very fast. I talked about, with the doctor example, about the variety of data. It comes in many forms. Some of it's structured, relatively easy to deal with. Some of it's unstructured. That could be text, that could be images, it could be video, it could be just a very loosely structured collection of results. So that variety is hard to deal with. And then most recently we've been adding the notion of veracity of data. And you may think, well, how can data lie? It lies all the time, right? It lies sometimes just because it's incomplete and you didn't see the whole picture. Or it lies because you've got multiple sources of this information, and they had different opinions, and so they phrased things slightly differently, and now you've got conflicting views. It lies because of errors in transcription. It lies because it's ambiguous. It lies because it's too late in getting to you. There are a lot of ways in which you can start to have doubts about your data, and as scientists, you all know that, right? Okay, so these are some of the challenges, and now that I've got you all depressed and worried, let me talk about what the good part, right? The good news is that there are a lot of valuable insights that can be gotten out of this mass of data that we're getting, and we have a lot of good examples of how we can do that. So, you know, imagine if you could so instrument the neonatal ward of a hospital that 24 hours before a baby develops a preemie, develops an infection, you could detect that that was likely to develop, take action, and save that baby's life. We can do that today, right? Imagine that you wanted to be able to optimize your placement of wind turbines so that you could get absolutely the best use of your capital investment and produce as much power as possible from them. Imagine you could actually know what the weather would be doing or what the wind would be doing, more to the point, in 10 square meter segments. That would give you a lot of ability to optimize. We can do that today, okay? And so on. So all the way down to this last one, imagine that just by mining data in the patents, the literature, and your own sources of information, the experiments you've run, and so on, you could rapidly accelerate the discovery of new materials or optimize them at later phases in the process that Dr. Vance talked about. So I don't know if you can, but I do know that we have some abilities in similar ways that in similar spaces where we've been able to make such sorts of jumps forward. So it's worthwhile to try. We really believe that, and we have good examples where scientists and business people have been able to do really important things with data. That's partly because there's a new generation of tools that are out there on the market that are that can help accelerate this ability to deal with different kinds of data. I'm not going to go through all the details of this. I'm not trying to make a commercial for IBM. Others do have this. But just to point out some of the key pieces of this, you see sort of in the middle here this Hadoop system, stream system, data warehouse role. These are examples of engines that have been over time built up that really know how to deal with the various characteristics of large data, those 4 V's that we talked about, that are tuned for that. We're starting to have libraries of what we call accelerators. These are wonderful, very powerful tools that let you deal either with particular data types or particular kinds of analysis and analytics that we can bring to bear, and I'll kind of talk you through an example of one of those in a minute. And then, of course, very powerful tools out there for visualization, discovery, for developing new analytic applications, and so on. And at the bottom of this all, fundamental, we believe, to sharing and to meeting goals is you have to have really good systems for information integration and governance. And again, there are many, many products out there that can help with this. We happen to like our platform, but that'll be the end of my commercial. Now, my personal role in life, I'm in the research division. My institute, such as it is building, taking a platform similar to this and trying to advance the technologies really across the entire stack, including up through our mathematical capabilities, to create an open platform sort of environment where we can work together with scientists and try to see how we can advance these technologies so that we can dramatically reduce the amount of time it takes the scientists to be connected and to and able to get to their focus area, their data. I talked to some of my colleagues who do a lot of analytic work with clients, trying to test out their newest mathematical theories and so on, and they tell me that almost 95% of their time today is spent dealing with the data. So if I could somehow accelerate that by 50%, if I could cut the time before they actually do the analysis in half, I think it would make a dramatic difference in their lives. And that's my research area and what I want to try and do. So an example from the pharma space, very, very analogous in some ways to what Cyrus showed us a few minutes ago. You all are probably aware that it takes a very long time today to get from the scientist with the aha about, oh, here's the biological target that might help me treat this drug, treat this disease, and a drug that might be able to attack that biological target, to a place where you can actually put that in the hands of the patients and treat them and see positive outcomes. If we focus just on this early part, the target identification, lead discovery pieces, they start out with one of those great funnels, right? Huge numbers of candidates of biological targets and drugs that might work with them. Takes them many, many years just to test those theories and combinations, dropping out possibilities all the way along, and then only a very few of them get through this preclinical development into clinical trial. And then there's many years of clinical trials and so on before you get out there. So we had we have a lot of data that we can bring to bear and a lot of analytic capabilities. And so you can see some, but by no means all of the kinds of data sets available now for the pharma and industry and the researchers to deal with. I'm going to focus today not on all of these different kinds of analytics capabilities, but just take an example of what we've done with text analytics, a place where we've made very rapid strides over the last few years, and which you might not think of as so fundamental to science, but where we have seen real potential in this industry. So they have, so a consortium of pharmaceutical agencies decided that they needed to work together and came together to collaborate in what, as you're probably aware, is a very cutthroat, very competitive environment. But they realized that they were all struggling with certain pre-competitive issues around finding new ideas, finding the best available IP, and so on, and that they couldn't process the data fast enough. They wanted to be able to learn from, for example, the patent data and the scientific literature, what other people were doing, what was going on out there, and then they figured their competitive advantage would be how well did they take advantage of that data. So it was to all of their benefits to kind of get data together better, and then how well they took advantage of it and used it to drive their IP portfolio was going to be how they competed. So what we've done with them over the last 5 or 6 years has been to apply our text analytics to the patent literature, the scientific literature. We had to teach it how to recognize chemical compounds. That's kind of the core hard computer science problem there. Well, it's related to chemistry. You guys can't seem to all call your compounds the same things, and you have different structures for representing them, and I don't quite get it, not being a material scientist, but I know it's a problem. And so we had to come up with new analytics that would help us be able to index and aggregate information about these compounds, extract them, start to enrich them with the insight we could get from these different patents and papers, so that we got a much richer set of entities, and then put together search and analysis and reasoning capabilities to let them go further. Okay, much too fancy a chart. So, you know, what do people get out of this? Why were the pharmas so excited, and why are they using this? They get to see the competitive landscape very well. If they're good at this, they'll see the white space. They'll know where people are not patenting, what things are not being explored. They may see some interesting correlations. That tells them where to jump. They're looking for, you know, obviously for research and development. They're trying to leverage what's been learned to do a better job. But also, they're looking at building their businesses, and they're building them, in fact, by targeting, you know, the researcher who has the great idea. Let me go out and pay a fortune for him, right? And that's one way to acquire things. Or the little company, the little startup. How do I get them and nurture them? Where should I spend my money so as to get the best results and to accelerate things? So just you know, a little example, I'll flip through this quickly. I mean, basically what we gave them was a framework in which a lot of different kinds of analyses are gathered together, and the key steps are to figure out, you know, what are the key entities that you care about, extract information from them, pull them together into profiles, and so you can sort of see you're gathering from a disease. You want to start to think about the organisms that are there, the organs they affect, the cell lines, the tissues, and so on. You may want to gather data about patients that you wouldn't get from the patent literature, so this chart doesn't quite match, but the medicines up top, you can learn a lot from the literature about the drugs, their activities, the half-life, the protein binding, and so on. And as you get this rich portrait. You can now think about relationships, do analysis there of that, and then you can start to reason about cause and effect and about relationships and where, about toxicity, about other sorts of things that are very, very important in the pharmaceutical community. So just an example, would be remiss if I didn't say something about data governance. It's a very key point. I think the point I want to make here is that there is a lot known about how to manage data in ways that can allow really good sharing of the parts you want to share and good privacy around what you want to keep private, ranging from very gross solutions like leveraging private versus public clouds so that you can keep what you need to keep proprietary and you can make public what is advantageous to share, to then within your systems a variety of different techniques for dealing with all the different aspects of keeping information safe, clean, and secure around that. And finally, I'll wrap up. I mean, there's a lot that I believe, obviously, passionately can be done by leveraging data and content to accelerate discovery, to keep from repeating work unintentionally that others are doing. There is a lot of value buried in there, but there's a lot of difficulty in getting it out. However, we do have tools that can help today, and we're working as a field on even more tools down that line, and that we really believe that there are good controls for sharing and data governance that can help accelerate discovery. I'll stop there.
Probably move on to the to the second speaker of this session, Professor Krishna and Rajan. We'll talk about mapping of the materials genome, and then afterward, as time permits, we'll have a time for a few questions also to Laura.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. To this audience, I don't have to introduce the ideas that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the day in terms of what our views and approaches are for modeling and integrating material science data and everything else. So what I thought I did do to this morning is segue into what Laura has said and try to take her cue about what her definition of big data and try to put that in a material science set of examples. So that's what my talk is going to be. And in the process, my concluding point is that as material scientists, and when we talk about data and the need to acquire data, that we're only dealing with one of the V's and not the remaining three. So that's my net conclusion. So then, you know, if the rest of the talk is missed. Okay, it's a very crowded slide, but I'm going to make some, for the purposes of partly provocation, but partly from the point of view of where my own research is going, is we tend to look at what I call our existing paradigms, affirmative, meaning that we usually think the answer is yes to these questions. And I'm going to make the proposition, well, the answer is not necessarily yes. In fact, I would say sometimes a strong no, sometimes a maybe. And I think if we acknowledge that, then our approach of linking what Cyrus has said and making that into a practical reality and not just a desire can be achieved. And I will come back to Laura's comment of saying, okay, where are the issues with respect to the volume, velocity, variety, and veracity, and trying to put that in terms of what we do in material science was a bit of a challenge because we don't think in those terms. And I'm going to give you my version of it, and then I'm sure other versions will be there. And I'd like to acknowledge my friend Joe Glick, who's here, for bringing this point to this particular slide to attention, this reference about in the genomics community, about the concept of gap, the gap between data and what you actually know. So if you, I'll show this graph again later, but the idea is simply being that if I increase the amount of data, that somehow I become smarter along the way. And the answer is not necessarily. In fact, you can generate more data and be left further and further behind. So I think the aim in our life, if we're going to put, and since my talk is in the not on the application side, obviously I work in applications, but the talk is in the data side of this meeting. Our aim should be not just to generate the data, but what do we do to close the gap? And how do we manage that process? if we do it that way, then it I wouldn't say complete, but changes the way we look at the problem. And doesn't mean that the things we're doing we should be stopped, but it means that we have to look at things other ways that we're not doing right now. So this is my genome equation. Materials property is a function of lots of things. If you discover any one of those things in pairs, you have a law named after you. You become famous. And by the way, talking about workforce development, Cyrus, I've got this done in the periodic table. So we now teach kids and say, suppose I give you the periodic table, which is a beautiful exercise in data mining, by the way, and what Mikhail Mendeleev managed to do is to find a two-dimensional manifold of an n-dimensional problem. If you want, that's my definition of chemistry. And if you present it that way, we can discover the rules that we teach in high school chemistry without telling them what the rules are. And I'm not doing that. In fact, I have another talk saying how should we redo first year material science curriculum, but that's another discussion, another day. I've spilled a lot of blood at faculty meetings on that issue. But I think the issue here is, let's suppose you know what the x1, x2, x3s are, and you know how to correlate them. Those are called models. And those models and which is important and how they're defined are very, very complex. And we do that for lots of things, whether you're dealing with plasticity models, whether you're dealing with Schrodinger's equation, whether you're dealing with heat transfer problems, how do you couple that? I would argue that solidification is probably one of the best test beds for multi-scale modeling that we've had for generations, because it has mixed the mathematicians and the physicists and the engineers in a very, very nice way. And I think but we can't wait 35, 40 years to do this. And I think that's the whole point. So here's what I'm going to do is, following Laura's, I want to put my talk in the context that Laura's doing, so it's not a totally separate issue. So we have these 4 V's, and what I'll do is walk our way through examples that we've been working on in those 4 V's, one dealing with volume. And volume, we actually have a lot. We do have a framework, and one is, of course, crystallographic databases, which has been around for a long time, and which is actually, in the formal language of data sets, it's a hierarchical database. A hierarchical database because the laws of symmetry are hierarchical. And so we have a scenario where we just can't arbitrarily say, oh, this is more important than something else. Crystallography is a very nice example to do that. The thermodynamic databases, of course, we have phase diagrams. We have thermodynamic databases based on electronic structure calculations, thermodynamic databases based on chemical thermodynamics calculations, and property databases, and so on. Speaking of data in terms of velocity, and I'll give my editorial opinion. As material scientists, we don't take advantage of this. We build synchrotrons. We build instruments that can collect data very, very rapidly. And then what do? We take that data and stop it. We stop it, move it over to the left-hand side of this column, and then analyze it. So I would make the argument that we're not taking advantage of the ability that we're investing massive amounts of physical infrastructure and analytical infrastructure in collecting the data with in situ dynamics, but we're not taking the advantage of the velocity component of that data. And that's an argument. So I'm going to give you an example of something we're doing in terms of time of flight data, in terms of another technique which I work on. It's not the experimental side of our program, which is called atom probe, which is actually a very interesting time of flight experiment. And finally, I'd like to couple these last two, which is, I think, the real hard part, the variety and the veracity. The veracity, this may seem sacrilegious to say in this room, but incomplete data, phase diagrams. I'd like to remind ourselves that how many times we show phase diagrams in class and actually put the experimental data points associated with those phase diagrams. I've run phase diagram meetings where I've had colleagues argue strenuously the difference between 40 degrees as to why a data point doesn't fit the actual calculation. I mean, people's careers have been built on this, not just for the sake of being argumentative, but because it captures some very important physics, and that's why we're so passionate about it. So, let me begin. And these are all examples from my own program, but I thought it'll be a good way to put some footing to this. There are a lot of other examples, I'm sure. Let's take volume of data. And just as an example, I'm looking at here at molten salts. One of the most advanced materials, probably the most advanced material for us is steel making, which is something we don't teach too much these days. My undergraduate training was in one giant case study in steelmaking in retrospect. But one of the interesting things is this was data on molten salts, and it was developed, organized, tabulated by decades of work by, in this case, George Jantz, who was at RPI. And once he passed away, nobody thought any value of the data. And it transferred its way to Europe. And that's where the database now resides on this website you can see there. And this is an interesting translation between the classical approach to organize data in spreadsheets, in detailed tabulated form, synthesized, cleaned up, and now digitized with the issue of data provenance built in, with data models built in, and industries actually using it. So here's a case where some of the things you're talking about, Cyrus, already have been happening for the last 30 years. And this is 40 years of work. Interesting enough, we collect all this volume of data, but then we don't do anything with it. So one of the things we began to do was to interrogate this data and actually do something which we don't think too much of, is generate reference data. You know, for all this issue of collecting data, how much of that data do we actually believe in? And that's what I mean, you know, you're talking about combinatorial. I'm glad you raised the issue of combinatorics, because I've told my material science colleagues that there is a mathematics behind this, but that doesn't go down too well. But you're absolutely correct. So the issue here is, can we actually develop reference data? Reference data collection, and to be able to do that experimentally, has diminished over the years around the world. So there's very few laboratories where good reference data is actually used and developed experimentally. So one of the things we began to do is to work with groups that actually generate reference data, non-trivial process. One data point is one PhD thesis. That's the level of rigor you need to do. And can we use these methods of analytics that Laura's talked about, and actually generate what I loosely like to call data we believe in, as opposed to just saying we have data that we like to look at. And thermodynamics is probably a very good case study. The issues of looking at trends in data are important, but more importantly, from a material science point of view, you're looking for the exception. You're looking for the outlier. The outlier not because it's wrong, but because the physics is different. I mean, how many Nobel Prizes can we talk about which violate everything we teach in the first year material science course? This year's quasi-crystals, which our department was fortunate to be associated with, conducting polymers, superconducting ceramics, on and on. So the question is, it's one thing to say, aha, we have that discovery that then spawns a level of research, but then we can say, oh yes, we can rationalize it afterwards, but can we actually make those discoveries ahead of time? Crystallography, and by the way, when we talk about crystallographic databases, we often think of what we see in IUCR databases, but one that people should look at is this one, the zeolites. The zeolite database is really, really impressive. It doesn't just give you space groups and tons of chemistry, but then they break it down into all the topological issues mathematically of the various enumeration schemes that you can have these structures developed. And it's very important for, obviously, metal organic framework structures and so on. Now, the interesting thing is, we said, well, suppose you go into this data, which is public, accessible, beautiful websites. It has both PDF files, diagrams, interactive things. This is a open, lovely interactive database taking advantage of the IT issues along with the you know, is the data correct? Everything's built in. And the point is, nobody actually looks at that data and analyzes and say, can I predict the next zeolite? Can I predict, you see these articles where someone says, I come up with this new framework structure, with this new catalyst that has this great property. Okay, with that information, can I then do something, can I make the next one? So we said, well, let's look at that database and say, can we actually make predictions with it? And it turned out we couldn't. And then it took a couple of PhDs to figure out that using data mining methods and putting in the physics of group theory, we can actually build predictive models that can take the information from those databases and actually design new materials. So databases should not just be repositories of information, they should be laboratories. And how do you make that conversion is a very important issue. So here are two cases, very well established, been around for decades, and of databases that have all the things that we like to have and are actually there. This is a messy slide, but there's a reason for it. I put it this way. We're so obsessed with the idea that we need more data. The question is, we began to ask the question, is how much of that data that you use actually allowed to make a predictive model? So in this case, we were looking at problems in high temperature ceramics, trying to look at complex structures and trying to look at all the aspects of crystallography and bond chemistry, and said, how much information do we actually need to make a structural prediction or a property prediction, and versus how much more information we need, and basically, loosely put, that plateau region is that optimal window. So if very crudely put, I mean, looking at it after the fact, you say if you have too little information, I can't make a prediction. We all agree with that. We never think about the fact that if we have too much information or too much of the wrong kind of information, that you're not going to make the prediction either. So the question here is, it's not a question of data quality. The data is good. The question is, how does it impact the properties you're interested in? And that same data will impact certain properties more than others. Now, when you make that discovery, that's what we call physical laws. But the point is, how do you do that a priori if you're not looking at that? To discover that, we began to start dealing with more issues. We've gone to things like predator-prey algorithms, various combinatorial methods, and look at data analysis methods. So the mathematics is there. The question is, how do you bring that mathematics into the picture? And that's what we're trying to do in that case. So these are kind of three different cases where I want to talk where the data volume issue really, really drives the materials discovery issue. Data velocity. This is work we've been doing some years ago, and I'll give you some other examples where colleagues who do catalysis work in combinatorial methods. This is a picture of an IR camera where you have a microarray of catalyst powders with complex chemistries. You pass a hot gas over it. You have an IR camera. It's picking up the heat evolution. And the usual approach is, if I find this is in combinatorial science, people do this a lot, where you find the target material with an interesting property, and you say, I've discovered something. And I say, okay, that's fine. I'm very happy for you, and I work in the field, so I don't have any problems with it. But the question I have is, all right, but does it tell me how I got that? Does it tell me what do I do next? Does it tell me all the parameters that I'm putting in just because I'm changing the chemical libraries and composition? The answer, it doesn't. And so what we began to do was to take that and began to start extracting out of this and digitizing out of this tons of other information from the spectroscopy, the modeling, the characteristics of the chemistry, of the materials we're putting in, and began to start representing this data in lots of forms, ranging from heat maps, which is very well established in biology, to these kinds of eigenvalue plots where we begin to see correlations and actually say, if I have a 6-element catalyst, and now which combination of elements will give you the right property and why, and not just say, I got it. This is what we're doing. Let me give you another example of data velocity, which we don't normally think about, and this is a technique which is called atom probe tomography. For those of you, familiar with the alphabet soup of materials characterization, I'm not going to go through all the techniques that are listed there, but the grand challenge as a materials scientist is I want to see things really, really small, and I want to analyze the chemistry as small as I can. And the two are fundamentally conflicting religious views. I mean, you're trying to get these two things to meet is very, very hard. So aiming yourself for that corner is what we're trying to do. So atom probe tomography is a technique where we're actually pulling atoms off and literally by field evaporation methods, either by a laser or electrical pulse, and you get these very spectacular looking images. That is not a simulation, by the way. I always like to say we're now producing images that look almost as good as simulations. That is aluminum, which each dot there represents one atom. And in fact, we have different isotopes we can detect. And so the question was, while that's very impressive at one level, we're collecting that data at 100 million atoms, or I'm sorry, 1 million atoms an hour on average. That's a lot of data. That's just, and when I say 1 million atoms, with that one atom comes about 7 or 8 segments of data that comes with it. So what we're now doing is analyzing that data, and this is the dirty secret about this field is we produce these pictures, but most people don't show all the atoms. That's the irony of it, because if you show all the atoms, you can't you can't see anything. This is the paradox. So 99% of the papers in atom probe tomography don't tell you this, but that's, they actually pick out the papers, and pick out the pictures they want, color them, you can tune it, and say, I see a precipitate here, I see a cluster here, I see this there. I'm not saying the work is wrong, I'm just telling you the honest truth. That's how the data is presented. So our approach is to say, well, look, we want to capture that data, and if you want to take this field from here's a picture that confirms my material science interpretation to, can I do some really quantitative work in terms of interpreting these images, then it raises the bar. So now what we've done is I have people in my group who are PhDs in visualization. They're not material scientists, who do nothing but figure out all the algorithmic issues of how do we capture the different dimensionalities of data in real time. So we can begin to start seeing, because how these things evolve, because we're looking at complex microstructures. You have precipitates. Atoms evaporate at different times. They evaporate at different rates. They interact in different ways. And we had to figure out, are they coming off on their own? Are they coming off with other atoms? There's tons of information that we need to understand. And to do that, we've invested a huge amount of effort in analytics and visualization, real-time data collection. And this is something, so we've now come to, we had to completely redo all our software essentially to do that. Example of data variety. This is some work that just came out in Nature last month, a couple of months ago, and this is a case where we worked with a team of people who we were trying to make drug delivery materials for solving real diseases. In fact, the plague was the one that we were working with. So we work with immunologists who sit in these BSL labs. We work with people who do whole images of mouse and immunology studies. We have people who do microarray studies in vaccines. And we have polymer chemists who are sitting there mixing tons of polymers to make polymers in various formulations. And the data sets are not, I can assure you, are not equivalent. I mean, there's no way, they're not even, the people we're working with don't even think in terms of data. That's the point. So how do you, so this picture here, apart from, was this paper, it was what the hardest part from our perspective wasn't the math. The hardest part was to figure out how to take all these different data sets and translate it into a form that can be mathematically manipulated. And that's a very, very hard task. And if you do it, well, we actually are able to predict and design a polymeric drug delivery material. And for those of you familiar with this field, the vaccine development area, the pharmaceuticals, and the drug delivery communities do not work together. You can discover vaccines, but delivering the vaccines is another issue. The second problem is, the fact is that how do you integrate that information so that we're not just saying, do I have a material that has a certain physical chemical property, but we're also predicting transport properties. So we were able to predict diffusion behavior, link it back to traditional models of transport behavior that a chemical engineer will do, along with figuring out the physics and chemistry of the material. So this is a case where data variety is a huge issue and a successful one. Data veracity. And the veracity issue is really, I think, one of the big problems of material science. We are not astronomers, okay? We are not ecologists. We don't have radio telescopes. We're not looking at the same laboratory like other communities do. If you're working within areas of the environment in a generic way, everyone's looking at a climate, or everyone's looking at a agricultural pattern or ecological pattern, and then trying to figure out how to piece that data together. And hence, that's the cultural issue. That's why they like to share data. Not because they're any more sociable than we are. It's just that they have no choice. They're looking at. We make all living in this room by having our own laboratories, and then saying we're the best doing it, and then saying we can find something that the other guy can't. So that's a cultural challenge we have to deal with. However, having said that, on a scientific level, the data sets that we tend to deal with are sparse. It's a bit crowded here, but the issue here, we were dealing with the problem that we were saying, I want a material in a parameter space that doesn't exist. How do we normally do that? Well, we say, let's find something that's roughly in that direction and heuristically come up with some ideas and say, let me make something that looks something like that. That's the similarity question that Laura was talking about. Material science is similarity analysis. If it looks like a duck, let me see if it makes one. Let me make a superalloy. If it behaves like something else, I'll call it that. If I want to make a ceramic, I don't mean to be harsh, but I'm talking about my own community here, so I can be more harsh. But that's the problem. And how do we make significant advances in an accelerated way? Well, either two ways. Either we come up with an unexpected discovery that really overcomes a barrier. The second, which is the bad way of doing it, is called failure analysis, which is not a very good way of discovering new phenomena. Or three, what we normally do. You systematically go through the process and piece together the models and so on. So the challenge is, can we accelerate that process? So the question in this case, we're looking for high temperature multifunctional materials. So you had multiple properties, piezoelectrics. We wanted temperatures in the 1,000-degree range. What do we do? So what we said was, well, let's look at what we do know about the material systems we have. And we don't have that many, about 10, 15, in terms of materials that had a certain crystal structure, that had a certain class of chemistries, that had a multi-set of parameters in boundary conditions and properties, and the concept of a tolerance factor that many of you know is a driving force for piezoelectrics. Well, the fact that you have figures of merit, which is true in lots of problems of material science, is really, and it's implicit in that, is that you're identifying what you think is important. And therefore, you're using that as a metric to say, can I design new materials for whatever application? So what we decided to do was, let's throw the kitchen sink at it. We literally put everything from high school chemistry to quantum mechanics and put every parameter we could possibly think of and built this massive descriptor, what I call a descriptor database, which is a very different kind of database than just saying property in chemistry. And then we came up with what's called a QSAR, which is what the drug delivery people have. What they call it, it's interesting, they call it a quantitative structure-activity relationship. Now that's what in material science we keep telling our students we do. We don't, but that's what we keep telling them, that we teach them structure-property relationships. But how do you quantify that? And the idea of quantifying this as essentially a multivariate function is a well-established tool. Just to put this in context, for those of you who remember steelmaking, Martensite start temperatures, you have these long formulas. Martensite start temperature is a number times percentage of this element plus another number, another element. What was that? It was a series of graduate students over decades who had to do these multiple linear regressions for various alloys and come up with these equations. Those equations have become a foundation for a lot of materials design. Same with slag chemistry. You know, if you look at John Shipman's early papers and go all the way through chemical metallurgy, we have that. So those equations, by the way, had exactly the same form as these, okay? But in the process, except the difference here is we're doing it much faster. We're not taking 30 years of graduate students to do it. We're doing it with one graduate student and doing it with much better computations. And then we actually come up with predictive models, which actually tells us new parameters. To discover that, we're using things borrowed from information theory, like Shannon entropy methods, where we're sitting down trying to figure out, which is using communications theory to figure out what parameter contributes the most to a given problem. And this is the kind of tools we're bringing to bear. And Cyrus, this is an example where your accelerated chart actually works. For those of you who can't read in the back, it's a Curie temperature that versus the year in which it was discovered. And we're looking for higher and higher Curie temperatures. The left-hand side here is what we know. The right-hand side here is what we discovered in the last 1 year. And we've gone past your 2-year thing, and I've got more plots like this for other problems. So, but the beauty of this is that we can put in other kinds of characteristics. We can start putting design characteristics, processing characteristics, fabrication characteristics. And so it's not limited to just the crystal chemistry problems that I'm using here. These are my kind of quick examples in terms of what Laura said that I think where material science can in fact follow that big data problem. So having said that, I'd like to close with 2 examples of what my vision of a database. And there are 2 different examples that we're working on in my group. And we would like to share this. In fact, we're trying to set this up right now. We're sharing this with the colleagues we work with, but this is something we'd like to make available to the whole community. On the top left-hand side is a new kind of phase diagram for intermetallics, where we have scaled the behavior of intermetallics in terms of their structural characteristics by using what we call an information entropy scale, where we look at a large number of characteristics and taking all the classical rules that we know or we've used for alloy design, Hume-Rothery, Boozer-Pearson, Sheckman, Villers. All these guys were smart. They all came up with various pedophore. All these groups have historically come up with various metrics to define what are the things that contribute as to why does an alloy form the way it does. A very fundamental question. How do you glue all that together? Well, we glued that together where we got this ternary phase diagram of valence effects, electronegativity effects, and size effects. So now we put all these crystal chemistries in, and interestingly enough, they cluster not the way, they don't cluster in the normal ways we normally look at these, we teach students about these compounds. We talk about Zintal compounds, we talk about Lave's compounds, but if you read the fine print, when we talk about these materials, we always say, this material is a Zintal compound, except a few aren't. So after we give these eloquent explanation of why a certain material behaves the way it does, we have a little caveat, except. And we have tons of these exceptions. Our field is littered with these exceptions. So my view is rather than trying to ignore them, let's celebrate it. And the idea is we're trying to build strong classifiers. So that's the formal data mining term, is how do you find metrics that can really separate, and if they can't, try to interrogate why they can't. And find similarities when you don't expect to find similarities. That's the whole point. And so this point here is compounds which are dissimilar in some respects, maybe very similar in other respects. And that's a very key issue. This only has crystal chemistry issues. We ignore the crystal symmetry issues. So on the right-hand side is a pathway diagram, which is really, in the formalism of crystallography, it's called a Barninghausen tree, which looks at, take every crystal chemistry and say for a crystal structure, look at all the symmetry operations that you put on it. The laws of symmetry only say the material can only transform to certain other crystal structures in certain ways. That's not something you can play with. So if we start off with a given compound, you can't see it, but there are two different nodes. The red one is one set of compounds, and then say if I start off with a given compound on my phase diagram, what are the other possible compounds I can go to and transform to, or I can connect to? So on the left is pure crystal chemistry data, and the other is pure crystal symmetry data. And then we overlay the two on the bottom side, and you basically see what looks like one of these airline hub maps, saying which crystal structures and which crystal chemistries connect to each other. So the idea now is we give this to the design engineer, give this to the material scientist, and say, here is your interactive flight map. I want to go from here to here. I want to go from property A to property B. This is what I know. What do I do, and what are my chances of getting it? And what's the shortest route to get it? So this is what we're actually setting up here. And this is what I call a kind of a cartography approach. And by the way, this is from the New York Times last year. It's the same idea, that if I make a calculation of all the cell phones I get, and where are my highest level of density of calls, and where are they going, I can build a communications network to do that. So my argument, if you want a big project, not a small one, I want to propose a big project, is a communications network for material science. And that would be one, I think, that would be pre-competitive. There's enough generic information. I'm giving you some examples of taking public domain data, and I think we can do something with that. So that's proposition one. So I'd like to put that. Proposition two, how do you take that data, compress it, track it, capture all the data mining and statistical learning things I talked about, plus the modeling, in a way that I can keep the provenance of that information captured. And these barcodes are calculated based on statistical mining principles. These are, I didn't throw them up as schematics. I want to make this very, very clear to everybody in this room. So this is a case where this paper just came out, where we're looking at a complex array of appetite structures for various applications, and actually looking at all the characters. This is just, to put this in context, this is an eigenvalue bloating plot, looking at tons of variables and looking at what their relative contributions are. And then we scale that for the dozens and dozens of compounds. And then, and we've come up, and in fact, we're having a debate in my group that we need to come up with the standards for this, because I gave this problem to my group, and everybody came up with a different set of standards about how to set this up. But it's not unreasonable to do one. So we've decided that we're going to break it up into problems of barcodes for different applications, where we can do this for crystallography, we can do this for experimental data, and we can do it for electronic structure calculations, where we're now we're not just plotting the data, but we're actually plotting the correlations between that data that allow you to make predictions. So this is another genre of barcode concept that we'd like to put forward as how a data management system might evolve. And this is an example of one of them. So let me end with, I began with an equation for the materials genome. Let me give you my equation for materials by design. And that's what I have, is the materials by design concept, which is one, for those of you who might look at, there's a book written by Arthur von Hippel. For those of you familiar, he was very important setting up the material science department at MIT, and was on the concept of material science centers. And this is a book that was published back in the 70s. It was called Molecular Design, or Molecular Architecture of Materials. That book is out of print. Pretty well repeats what we're talking about today, okay? So these are not new ideas. And the argument is, and I would like to make the case, well, however you want to phrase it, is that our focus should evolve from just the volume issue where the experiments and physical models concentrate. Add the component of velocity, not just to take data that comes from fast sources, but take advantage of their speed to discover new things, which we don't do, in my opinion. And put the other components, which I feel we're not doing enough, is the variety and veracity parts. And for doing that, that's where the statistical learning informatics tools comes in. And I think if you put all these components together, then you got a materials by design, and that's the data that you want to manage and distribute. So thank you for your attention.
All right, be mindful that I'm now between you and your coffee. Let's nevertheless take a couple of questions if anyone has something they want.
So, in material science, our fundamental problem is that you write papers, which is toner on paper. Probably 99% or more of the data on which those conclusions were based are not available. Sometimes we're arrogant, we say, take my conclusions, don't look at my data. So while we can argue about how to store data, how to analyze it, which we all should do, our first problem is to make data available. I couldn't care less what form it's in, actually, because you can transform form. And start to require people to make data available. I think that would do two things. People would be more honest. There are not famous cases in Science and Nature where the editors of Science and Nature now seriously are thinking that people will have to make all their data sets freely available. They had a case in social sciences recently where, famous case in Holland where, multiple papers, fake data, where anybody who knows anything about data would have seen in an instant that the data set was fake. But it went on for almost 10 years. The other thing is that my principle is that we take our data and draw conclusions from it. I think the rest of the world might draw different conclusions and do creative things with it. It's a bit like the internet. The internet has allowed people to do a lot with data that other people invented. And I think we don't have that in material science. You have your data, I have my data, you have your data. And I think, getting to a point where we just make the data available, I think would be step number one. And then we can all get creative about what to do with it.
I don't disagree with anything you say, Cedar, but I'm adding another layer to that discussion. Okay, everything you say I agree with, but my argument is, while we do that, as material scientists, we're not taking into account the issues that Laura is talking about. We are putting data in the same form to make that creativity available. We have to reformat it and at least provide the options to explain to the material science community that what is this data actually doing? When I first got into this, my computer science colleagues say, what is the nature of your data? And I would sit here and they would show me these, I had no problem with your field, but you draw these nebulous diagrams, knowledge discovery, conversion of data to knowledge, and all these to us, very fuzzy, wuzzy terms. But it's taken me many years to intellectually appreciate the mathematical foundations of what those terms mean. And all I'm making the case is, yes, we make the data available. And that's why I deliberately picked my two examples at the beginning, two examples of databases that have been around for 30, 35 years, and say, we've had it. There's two cases where everything you talk about, it's not just, they don't only give you the data, they give you the papers. They give you the graphs, they tell you the references, they look at the analysis, you can dig into everything in one-stop shopping. But having said that, nobody was taking advantage of it. So my argument is, if we can glue what you're talking about, and we can do this for different communities, with the ideas that we have here, in terms of how, and partly I'm trying to put this in the context of meeting, where do we engage the data science community? I think we could have a better system to achieve what you're talking about. That the concept of that intuition that you're talking about is the tools of statistical inference and so on, I think can help achieve that. And I think the field of computer science has got to the point, and it's not a magic bullet. And that's why much of our work has been to see, can we rediscover what we already know without knowing the information we always describe. That's how we test a lot of our work to begin with. So in answer to your question, yes, and that's why I'm a strong advocate of this approach, is simply because it's modular. Everybody in this room can put their intuition, put their heuristics, put their uncertainties into this, and you can have different pathways and actually track the pathways of how you make these discoveries.
All right, last
famous materials, a lot of famous materials were developed or discovered by accident. Teflon, conductive polymers, this data mining, I mean, could you replace or like mimic some of those big leaps in discovery?
Yes, we can, and you know, it's a talk, but I'll just give you one example where for example, superconductivity. If you look at superconductors and high TC materials, we've done work which we've been working on where we're actually showing that a lot of these apparently, what we normally would call an outlier in 1987, actually fits certain patterns of similarity when you compare them with conventional intermetallics. So then the question is, if we had known that, what we would normally consider as an outlier, we wouldn't have even looked for. Now, if we had known that there's a pattern to be explored, we would have done that. So in answer to your question, I think that was the point I made, with the concept of outlier detection and looking at similarity analysis is what those discoveries could be addressed by these methods.
So let me just close by commenting on one of the questions. So in computational science, which sort of mathematical computational science I'm more familiar with, in fact, there's a growing community that is focusing on reproducibility, which is exactly the issue that is being raised, and there might be an interest in having a dialogue with that community. It's just been growing rapidly over the last few years. And the last thing I wanted to say, and most of you might have seen it on your cell phone by now, but the White House and OSTP has just announced a $200 million commitment over 6 federal agencies to support research and innovation in big data. So that ties in very well with this. So thank the speakers again, and